history. And today we're going to focus on an issue that's a little bit more recent, and that is in particular the 1960 election. And specifically, what if Richard Milhouse Nixon won that election over John Fitzgerald Kennedy? And we are excited to be joined by Noah Kulwin of the Blowback podcast. Noah, thanks so much for joining us today, man.
Hey, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
No worries. So the way that we're doing this, we're kind of starting with the world as it actually is so we could understand how things might have changed. So Noah, why don't you set the scene about what JFK actually did and what are some of the important hinge points that we're going to be talking about today?
Right. So JFK, listeners should recall, he didn't really have that much of a tenure in office, 1,000 days, as Arthur Schlesinger famously termed it in his book. And so the accomplishments that he did make were often not really these, big legislative or administrative achievements that we remember decades later, because his administration didn't have the juice to get any of that kind of stuff through. So
you wouldn't listen to LBJ. He was right there. He was telling them what to do. And they're like, sure, Grandpa.
Yeah. So what you have instead is more of a set of positions that are substantial evolutions from the previous occupant of the White House, and that will effectively determine the trajectory of the 60s vis-a-vis the federal government in a number of key areas, in terms of labor racketeering in the Justice Department, in terms of civil rights, and in terms of, I would really strongly argue, the, broadly speaking, what we would consider the quasi-confrontational posture that was adopted by the executive branch. The fact that the executive branch over the course of the 60s felt, yes, compelled to wage a Cold War, but as was the case during the 1950s, was ultimately a force handcuffed to a military whose goals and interests were often strongly divergent. And so the question then becomes, in 1960, were one man, a different man, to win that White House spot, I suppose, would the coalition, would the powers of play have broken in some different fashion? Would it have gone down different?
And maybe before we even get into the hinge point, Matt, why don't you tell us who is Richard Milhouse Nixon? What social forces does Dick Nixon represent in 1960? One of your favorite topics.
Richard Nixon is the revenge of Main Street. He is the middle class subject, really, confronting the reality of competing for power in the context of America's class and the world's class apocalypse of World War II. And the American middle class that comes out of that is in a constant churning state of anxiety, resentment, fear of falling, and self-loathing at one's lack of acceptance by the powers that are both repulsive and also the only sources of power or affirmation in life. So Nixon, the son of a struggling grocer from Whittier, California, who had to go to his local Whittier college because he couldn't afford or get a scholarship or be brought in as a fucking legacy like John F. Kennedy. If anyone wants to laugh, anybody ever wants to laugh, look up John F. Kennedy's admissions essay to Harvard. If you want to chuckle, it might as well have been written in fucking crayon.
It's like he was a fourth grader. It's a goddamn shame.
To Harvard. It is a good school and would give me a good liberal arts education. So he had to go to Whittier, where he had to form the Orthogonians because the Franklins wouldn't let him in, and spends World War II making money at a poker table in a rear echelon supply depot in the Pacific. Comes home, gets his Navy uniform, sells his soul to a pack of jackals from Orange County, the real estate fascists who are going to end up funding this entire anti-New Deal movement that is going to emerge and become politically articulate in the coming decades. He goes up to the Bay Area and swamps poor Jerry Voorhees, a classic fellow traveler, useful idiot style, do-gooding liberal who was effectively an ally to the American Communist Party without knowing it. Bye-bye, Jerry. And he becomes representative, uses the Red Scare to can't come to power, becomes a senator at an incredibly young age, really mirrors JFK in his ascent, but again, from this churning, anxious, resentful position. And then he
Frontier
spends,
also with Nixon.
he is able to secure the 1952 Republican nomination for vice president by spending the train ride from California to the RNC, convincing Earl Weaver to support Nixon for the president's or for Eisenhower against Taft. And then his reward for that is the vice presidency, where he spends 8 years being held at arm's length by a Eisenhower who looks down on him as a grubby little politician.
And there's a lot, there is so much to back up Eisenhower's intuition about Nixon, even at that time and at that stage of his career, because one of my favorite examples of sort of Nixon cronyism, to speak to the power base he represents, was that he was deeply in bed with the real estate lobby, and especially the SNLs, who were really, really critical to encouraging the right kind of population growth and real estate development in Southern California. And one of Nixon's last acts, it was involved as a very controversial measure as a senator to get involved to kill public housing in Los Angeles, which I mainly bring up because public housing was one of the big issues where Nixon and Kennedy did diverge, and where Kennedy, with the New Frontier in 1961, was actually able to introduce something that Nixon might have been straight up opposed to, at least on domestic policy, in terms of where you can see like a straight up plus or negative on a single definable issue that also goes right to the heart of, the way Nixon operates, because Joe Crail, a figure I've written about, a California SNL executive, was one of the first donors to the Nixon slush fund and one of the leaders of the campaign to kill public housing in Los Angeles, a campaign with which Nixon assisted gratefully.
So while Eisenhower held Nixon at arm's length and kind of undercut him a few times, Nixon never forgave him for having the Fed sort of allow, and in fact kind of encourage, a recession to cool down the economy in the late 50s, and that he blamed partially on his defeat. But one thing Eisenhower did give him at the end of his second term was control, was White House, was executive control of the task force to overthrow the new Castro regime in Cuba. So whereas Kennedy has the Bay of Pigs plan kind of dropped on his lap when he is inaugurated, Nixon, before he even would have become president, is already deeply invested in this project and has a proprietary relationship to it, which I think means that if we assume a few thousand dead people change their minds in Illinois and he becomes president, means that we can sort of assume that if he were president, I really do think he would have done what he said after words to other people many times he would have done, which is greenlight a bombing campaign. And if that didn't do it, if that didn't get the rebels off of the beachhead, then send in the fucking Marines. And I think he would have done all of that. The question is, okay, what then happens?
Right. Okay. A couple of things. One thing that I always find interesting is that Nancy Pelosi is currently in the same congressional district as Nixon was in Northern California. A fun little historical fact there. So let's say that what Matt said is right. A few dead people vote differently, and Nixon wins a 60 election. And what Matt was referring to was the Bay of Pigs. So Noah, you just did a thing on Cuba. What actually happens during the Bay of Pigs? What decision does Kennedy make? And then what decision might Nixon make?
So I think that Matt made the point, made the correct first point, which is that basically the Bay of Pigs was dropped on Kennedy's lap. Although he's famous for saying in its aftermath that defeat, victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. So that comes out of the disaster at the Bay of Pigs, where he's basically saying, yep, I got to take responsibility for it. But, everybody knows that this was something that had been developed for years because of the, years-long campaign against Castro that sort of reaches, a sort of 2-year zenith, let's say, beginning around when Kennedy takes office, actually. And the really nutty part of it is that the plan, even though it was dropped on Kennedy's lap, was a terrible plan. There wasn't really it did not have any realistic chance of succeeding, because Allen Dulles, the historical evidence, I would argue, indicates that he believed that one of two things. He believed, one, or both rather, he believed that there would be a successful assassination of Castro and key members of the Cuban leadership on the island prior to the invasion, and that would create an opening for even a shitty invasion to work, which is not dissimilar to what happened in Guatemala in 1954.
So were they basically like crossing their fingers that the mafia would get the job done there?
Well, they say, it's like, it's interesting that you say crossing their fingers, because it's like functionally that's what they were doing, but in their heads they may have believed like, oh, we're getting him done. We're getting him this time.
We've had talks. These Italian gentlemen have the whole thing under control.
The Italian element is secure, sir. The Italian element, yeah. Like they thought they had it totally locked down, the whole thing, and then the other big problem, that they had, or rather that Dulles was relying on, and that didn't come through, was that if things didn't go right, that Kennedy would pull the trigger on a wider invasion, and
you would have to for the prestige.
Exactly,
and this prestige.
And this is a very this was the wrong assumption for a number of reasons. And ultimately the invasion fails, on the ground, because they don't have air support. The boats aren't right. Ammunition
Kennedy
falls
refuses
in the water.
air support. That's the big choice, is that Kennedy basically says.
I mean, the air support bit is, even if he had supplied it, it's not really clear that it would have helped ultimately. However, the memory becomes, and something that is, relevant to the Kennedy-Nixon argument, is that Kennedy in the 1960 campaign had run to the right of Richard Nixon on Cuba. He had basically, in a debate, said, Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, they're as powerful as ever. We're gonna, it's like, and what has Nixon done? Whereas Nixon, he's like, that goddamn Kennedy and his Jews, like, da-da-da-da. Like, they know that I've done stuff, but I can't say it because, Dulles briefed them, da-da-da. And, the secret honor, if you want to hear that whole rant. But this difference in tack, Kennedy decides not to pull the trigger, not to give the air support, make it clear that he's not going to go through with it. And Nixon's argument, as Matt has said, was that actually, no, you have to fight communism everywhere, and you got it. We should have sent in the Marines. We should have sealed the deal. And I'm not sure that.
So does Nixon actually do that? So it's something.
That's it's a great.
So this is the real question. Setup. There's that decision point, right? Let's say the invasion begins as it does in our timeline, where the invaders aren't doing especially well. They're getting railed by the defenses in Cuba. Nixon is faced with this choice to send in air support. Does he do it? And if he does, what does that mean? Do we get a Vietnam style quagmire? Does the invasion actually succeed? Does that actually lead people on the island to rise up against Castro? The mafia did have a lot of capital invested in Cuba and had for decades at that point. What do you think happens?
Or
Nixon, right? Or nuclear war. So what do you guys think happens if Nixon makes the choice? Let's say he makes the choice for air support.
I would guess that if Nixon were to make the choice for air support, the first thing that would happen, and would really be the first test, is the diplomatic interventions. In 1950, when Truman, and this is the recent precedent for international crisis at that moment, Truman is, he mentions and just affirms that he's the guy who drops atomic bombs, and Clement Attlee is already on a plane. He's already on the phone, and he's, our best friend, and they have troops in Korea. So, and he's saying, shut the fuck up, Harry. So the thing that Kennedy never had, that the historical record does not show that Kennedy really had to deal with, was that there would be a meaningful big question of I should actually give air cover. And it was never really that dramatic of a question. The record seems to kind of indicate. I think in the case of Nixon, it would be, I am not so sure that he would have actually continued through with such a large military operation if all of a sudden everybody at the UN and in the West is on the phone with him saying, if you do this, the rest of the world will not respect you. They will think of you as the Nazis. And because at that moment, the idea of American prestige and freedom as, outweighing its economic power, I just don't feel that they could have. I think that Nixon would have been more conscious of it just simply by being the guy in the chair. It's a heavily moderating influence.
So then if he drops the bombs, I think we all would say, even if that happened, that still does not make the Pay It Big successful. You're still going to have them get rolled up from the beachhead because they just don't. It was a bad plan, poorly executed, and insufficient to begin with.
It would be a fear strategy. The idea, and
Okay,
that's,
but
yeah.
But let's say we also have to think about staffing, because Noah, I think you're right to a certain degree. There is this sort of liberal internationalist moderating influence that Kennedy himself embodies. But what if Nixon's on the phone with Curtis LeMay? What if Nixon's on the phone with these other strategic air command people who really want to demonstrate that you actually can use atomic bombs and they don't always have to be used to end a war?
They're good for your teeth.
Right. Maybe what it's not impossible, at least from my perspective, to imagine a world where Nixon does the air support fails, and then he's talking to Strategic Air Command, and they're like, "Okay, tactical nukes. Why not use tactical nukes?"
I don't disagree at all. To me, the thing that feels like, and I think it's very possible,
because Nixon. One more thing I want to add, because Nixon would also want to separate himself from Eisenhower, because Eisenhower was so consciously not the guy who's not going to do rollback. And Nixon resented Eisenhower. He would want to shore up himself, particularly with the generals, particularly because you have someone in the Republican Party who's not a general like Eisenhower, right? So he's more apt.
He might split the baby and then do the invasion. So it's like, if the question is just let the invasion die or drop a nuke, I am at the end of the day a human being enmeshed in human institutions, and that is a bridge too far, especially when you consider that this would be a Nixon who would be like 5 years less crazy than the one who became president.
Well,
the thing in his head, it was, it's time release as it is in anyone. So he's like more together in 1960.
Well, and also, I do think that, again, like one of the things that's also hard, I think, to people like, anti-communism and Nazism have in common the tremendous ability for people to rationalize stuff that they know is bullshit, but because they believe that the outcome is worth it. So they're like, yeah, listen, like I know that guy who says that like Jesus is coming next Tuesday and that like all the Jews have to like give their blood is, he's a little bit crazy, but he's also like the Clark County Republican Party chair. So we got to listen to him. And so, like that's part of it. And in the case of Nixon, this is something where I am pretty much persuaded by like the basic Rick Perlstein argument about the guy's character in terms of that, like he never really could fully reject that. There's a reason Kissinger was the guy running his foreign policy as opposed to somebody further to the right, because ultimately he viewed himself as, at best, right, an incredibly competent like servant and new legacy within, the pantheon of American leaders, and that doesn't include crazies. And that's, something that ultimately is, I would argue, like part of what leads to his downfall, surrounding Watergate many, many years later. Okay,
so then we take off the board two possibilities. They do the bombing, America tips its hand, which happened anyway. That didn't work. We say, oops. Then you get probably the similar thing. You get a Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's assume that it's similarly as in our world doesn't do nuke. Or he drops the nuke in some way out of that. And either one of those, we're kind of done talking.
Well, I think
at least about this specific thing. But the one that is left then is, what if he decides, okay, we're going to send in an American peacekeeping operation. We cloak it in the language of a police action. We say, well, the way we did in the Dominican Republic 10 years later,
Korea
5 years,
2.0.
like in 1965. And then basically dare the Soviets to then escalate to nukes. And Khrushchev would not have done that. I think we can all agree that Khrushchev would not have, in that situation, willingly launched a first strike.
Well, I would also say that the other thing to consider is that the way Nixon conceived of it, and a lot of conservatives conceived about the debate, was that there were two, like Cuba was, if anything, like and this is it actually is kind of helpful the way the CIA organized their divisions about it, like in the Kennedy years, they would, they created like a whole Cuba desk within the CIA, and your CIA stations all over the world would have a Cuba desk officer. And so Cuba, in a sense, like you could forget the geographic location. It became like a whole other specific front in the Cold War. So, okay, if that's one front, what are the other fronts? And if the Cold War is this global war, as Nixon and others conceived it, where, when you apply pressure here and ease pressure here, what are the things that maybe if we ratchet the heat up in Cuba that we could get away with in, say, Berlin or in Vietnam? And so that, to me, is some of where I think the Cuban Missile Crisis becomes an opportunity to see, we call it a Cuban Missile Crisis in part because Americans were never apprised popularly of the fact that it had these global geopolitical implications, and that those were ultimately the considerations moderating the Americans' hands most strongly. And that, which was, the idea that, like, if the Americans move on Cuba, the Soviets move in Berlin. Because, East Berlin, or Berlin, sorry, let me rephrase, Berlin, rather, is like, 60 miles into, or 100 miles into East Germany. And so there was the very real idea, that the U.S. actually, when it came time push come to shove, that the U.S. would actually have, the Soviet Union had more leverage than the U.S. even at its most fundamentalist individuals was, ever really willing to acknowledge.
And also, when we're talking about the Bay of Pigs, that's happening in the midst of the Second Berlin crisis, where it's just like this liminal period where Khrushchev has made several threats about maybe, just taking West Berlin. And so that I think does legitimately function as a moderating influence. The only difference is the question is Nixon enough of a psychopath effectively to be like, it's the Caribbean is the American lake, and my status with the military and particularly the Air Force depends on me doing something here. I think Kennedy is able to say no in a way because he has a relatively somewhat oppositional stance, particularly his staff, towards the uniformed military, where Nixon would have a totally different power base. And that leads to my next question. So, Noah, maybe you can describe, what does the CIA think of Kennedy, and how is that different if Nixon is president?
So I think that the CIA, if anything, looked at Kennedy really favorably, and their antagonism to him only really began, and was not complete, by the way. Like, the CIA shouldn't be described as a monolith. It was even as an institution with its own differing power centers and so on. But on the whole, they began pretty enamored with it. Allen Dulles favored Kennedy over Nixon, in part not just because the CIA thought of themselves as the most effective and cosmopolitan and engaged with the world of all the major national security agencies. I think that they really would have probably viewed Kennedy as, hey, listen, if Nixon doesn't hold on for another 4 years, which he probably won't, because historically that's not really, the successor to a two-term president is often, not somebody who in their own right is able to succeed and extend the project. And so I think that there would have probably been, you could argue that, the Cuba crisis may have just come 4 years, in 1965 or something, as opposed to 62, after Kennedy wins in his first presidential election, after Nixon loses, because he, the economy is okay, but it, there is some inflation beginning to crop up, which was the case by the mid 60s, that is also beginning to undergird the social discontent that is beginning to pour out across the country. Imagining a Republican president in the beginning of the 60s for the civil rights movement would have been fucking crazy. And that would have probably been another really powerful moderating or difficult influence for any Republican, president looking to court a Southern political base for the future, which Nixon political strategists were already hoping to do. It's hard to, it's interesting.
I think we got to pause for a second here, because I want to hear what you guys think about Nixon's state of mind in the early 1960s if he doesn't lose the election. What do you think he's like if he wins this election? Because I do think the Nixon of the early 1970s placed in the early 1960s is radical and makes relatively radical moves.
Oh yeah, no. If you have Nixon, just the guy, if you just transported him from his second term as president to from 73 to the early 60s, he's pressing the button, baby. Bye-bye. We're done for.
Totally.
He's absolutely pressing the button. He didn't he have to, it is on record that he actually did call in a nuclear fucking attack on North Korea, that he had to have his general's counterman, right? That happened? Or is that just alleged?
I'm not sure, honestly. Let me see.
This is in the archives, that he got rip shit during Watergate. And I think it was the Maya Gez incident.
I've heard about this. I'm not sure, but I have heard about this. My guess is that if I heard about it, it's probably real. Yeah.
But I think, you get him. But early 60s Nixon, who has only ever won an election, has never faced, a hostile, frothingly negative public the way that Nixon had to endure during his presidency. I think has more to lose in every sense, and therefore is going to play things much more cautiously than the Nixon that we had in our world.
So then this is interesting. So what Nixon is often famously referred to as the last New Deal president. So maybe we could talk a little bit about domestic policy before we maybe turn to Vietnam, which I'm curious what you guys think would happen. So how do you think Nixon is different on domestic policy? Noah, you were talking about the civil rights movement. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so I think, Nixon is sort of like your classic, like Bigfoot Bjornson, Southern California fascist, who is aligned primarily with real estate interests, big business as far as, manufacturing concerns, defense industrialists. It's a very, it's a fairly, new money crowd as far as these things go. A lot of people in a fairly new power base that is coming into being in the post-war period. And so as far as the civil rights, fights are concerned, fights over housing, and busing will ultimately, these are the, you can see the latent configurations that will become much more relevant later on when he's president, and that will, making up the silent majority, propelling him into power. And, in the case of Kennedy, the Democratic Party is, there is this long-term, issue where the Democratic Party's cosmopolitan, union, socially liberal interests can no longer abide being in the same part of the same, political party as the South. And so, the way I see it is that by the time 1960 rolls around, the trajectory is kind of largely understood, or at least felt, if not so explicitly articulated, to, the party mandarins for both Democrats and Republicans. But the way in which, these politicians individually each try to thread that needle of what the future is going to look like. And ultimately, if they, as individuals, come to, personally try to shepherd through civil rights legislation in the fashion that, if we're weighing it against history as it happened, which is LBJ doing it after the death of John F. Kennedy, and sort of acknowledging that he may be or that rather he is sending the Democratic Party into a tailspin. But it's for the Great Society, and it's to sustain the Vietnam War and so on. If that's sort of what we're weighing it against, then, I think that the way that the civil rights policies unfolded in the early 1960s with Nixon as president, I mean, it probably we would have seen a lot of the unresolved, or would have become really serious issues of inequality and poverty that were growing in the 1950s get even more serious. I mean, it would have been really difficult for America to stomach a story of selling the fact that, they have this beautiful interstate system, but also they have slums that look like Latin America's. I think that would have been the challenge that Nixon would have confronted. And would there have been a capitalist solution to that, a kind of, neoliberal, but 20 years earlier kind of policy initiative that could have made that work? I'm not sure. I think Nixon may have ultimately been forced to do, as he was in the case of price controls in the 70s, to resort to something that, people may have called socialistic, but he probably, like Truman, would have found a way to call it national security measures.
Okay, I got a real curveball for you guys.
Hit me.
I just thought of this. So we imagine Nixon in the White House dealing with domestic issues. Let's say that Cuba does not cause a conflagration, and we're still enmeshed there to a greater or lesser degree than we are now. But everything else, we're still dealing with. There's still nominally normal politics going on, and that means you have the civil rights movement, and the civil rights issue becoming the dominant domestic question, and putting huge fractures, as you said, on these party alliances. And at that point, the black vote was not united in any sense. It was essentially a tip ball between the parties. I believe that Kennedy won the black vote in 60, but very narrowly, and he was the first Democrat to do so since, I think, Truman. And that meant that there was like a sense that this black vote was up for grabs. What if instead of accelerating the Southern strategy that he eventually employed as president and trying to break off the white South, he instead tried to propose a capitalist program of domestic spending and rights extension, broken away from the Democratic Party and the labor movement, and pitched directly towards the black middle class, which was the activist engine of the civil rights movement in the first place.
But then you get to the big, there's the big wedge of the Nixon that is the interesting, X factor here, I think, which is the Hoffa and the fact that Nixon actually did have specific union allies that he would cultivate, because business unionism back in those days meant that you could be conservative and you could work with, I have some right-wing pamphlets that are printed by Joe Crail, that right-wing executive who donated to Nixon. And the pamphlets that I have all have union bugs on them. They're all made by union printers and so on. And it's just to say probably they're more union printers than they're necessarily Republican. But point being that, there were some, there was a more openness, I think, to unionism that, would have been one of the big questions that sort of comes into play here. How would that Nixon, do you think, have responded to the union question?
And ironically, that might have also even more firmly entrenched the New Deal state. Instead of in the 60s, if you have a Republican president entrenching the New Deal state, he could be basically the liberal Bill Clinton, which is an interesting thing to think about.
And maybe you see Nixon as the guy who synthesized the New Deal state rather than the one who kind of was the harbinger of its destruction. Because he took a fucking just jackhammer to its social basis.
I think that would have been really tough, and sort of the only way that you can get away with sort of stripping apart the New Deal is by maintaining the Cold War. And for the Cold War to be maintained, that's how Vietnam emerges as this almost historically predetermined locale for America to wage a conflict. And there becomes, I guess, this very, there had once been a wing of the Republican Party, the Robert Tafts, who said, look, we want laissez-faire economics, and we don't want to just have this crazy military that makes the laissez-faire economics possible. And that was shut out of the party basically, by the early 50s, even before 52. And so by 1960, if that whole, kind of restraining impulse is gone, it does feel to me that a lot of what we just ended up seeing in the 80s is, you're seeing a lot of the potentialities for that just to happen 20 years earlier, for there to instead be a, sort of aggressive posture about developing new markets and, creating new markets and using that language and so on. And, appearing willing to back up those desires, both by the force of guns, yes, but also ultimately in the 80s, what was super crucial was that the IMF and World Bank began doing, say, structural adjustments. And were those institutions, would that kind of coercion necessary for the Cold War to be waged in the way that it was in its later years? Could that have been possible decades earlier? I'm not so sure. So it sort of goes back to how aggressive would a Nixon have necessarily felt empowered to be in that situation?
And I think we need to talk a little bit then about what is his relationship, or what do you imagine his relationship being to the security state? And let's talk specifically about the uniformed military and then the CIA. We kind of got away from that question. So Noah, you were saying that initially the CIA, which of course can't be viewed as a monolith, but let's just broadly refer to it there, was more for Kennedy than Nixon. So let's say it's 61, Nixon is in office. How does he relate to the uniformed military, and how does he relate to the CIA?
Nixon, he loves uniformed boys. He loves their, he has an admiration for them, yes. He is also not one of them, and that he is not one of them, but is, sort of from their world, always gives him a kind of interesting adjacency. I think in the case of 1960, he is so much their guy for not just the anti-communism, but also, again, the defense contractors who are, they are the biggest employers, some of the biggest and most heavy political muscle. They are, involved in, pamphleteering anti-communism and trying to get their employees, sustaining the total war mobilization and consciousness well beyond World War II, well beyond Korea, and, into the 1960s. And I think that that sense of that the U.S. and the world is sort of in this constant, never-ending crisis, is the biggest thing that Nixon and the uniformed military shared. And that's a sense of it's a good sort of, I think, archetypal model actually for how reactionary bureaucrat and politicians tend to work with the military. It's hand in glove, but there are points of dissension, particularly because ultimately the politician is constrained by factors and considerations that the military leader is not, definitionally.
So that's a good summary. How do you think he'd relate to the CIA?
The CIA viewed Nixon, he's an anti-communist friend, et cetera, but they butted heads over the Cuba stuff because Nixon wanted results and he didn't get them and the CIA wasn't delivering them. And also Nixon didn't trust them. Nixon had a general who was on his staff, who was his CIA liaison, who the CIA, I think his name was Cushman, and the CIA just totally, Cushbomb, and they just totally, marginalized him, and Nixon fucking hated him. Nixon hated the CIA for treating as, he viewed them as rivals. And then, ultimately, however, when he becomes president, he has a very different relationship with them by them. Jefferson Morley literally wrote the book on it. And he sort of shows that, because the CIA as an institution is both set up to serve the president and its access to the president is what gives it protection, into doing all these very legally dicey things, like killing people and running covert wars and stuff. Nixon ultimately and the CIA did have a pretty fruitful relationship up until they didn't. And so I think that, there's Nixon was operationally probably much more in tune with the CIA, but in a kind of attitudinal sense about, it being kind of gauche to, talk about, the communists and how, communism is phony baloney and stuff like that. It was a little bit too crass for them. It was, it wasn't their style.
So then this brings us naturally to Vietnam. What does Nixon do in Vietnam? So Kennedy, obviously, there's lots of arguments about what he would have done, but what he does do is that he does approve, for example, the assassination of Ngo Diem. He does indicate that the United States is going to continue to intervene in Vietnam. He does send more advisors there. There's arguments about whether he would have done the escalation in 64, 65. But what do you guys think Nixon does as Vietnamese, South Vietnamese politics in particular begins to go haywire in the early 1960s? Does Nixon just say, forget it? Does Nixon say, I'm going to escalate? I'm going to send troops there? What does he do in 62, 63, 64?
I think it kind of depends on what's going on in Cuba. If you have sort of a status quo ante situation, Castro still in power, the U.S. probably at that point enjoined from interfering with him anymore to de-escalate from the nuclear confrontation that inevitably followed. Then I think you see something similar to what happened under Kennedy and Johnson, this dribble of advisors until the advisors couldn't be defended. Then you got to send the troops to defend the advisors, and then you got to send troops to defend the troops, and then you got Operation Dart and all that. I think you'd see something similar, maybe a little an accelerated timetable, but a similar, because I think Nixon had a similar insecurity relative to the military state that as Johnson did. Like Kennedy's big superpower and the thing that got him killed was his noblesse oblige and his aristocratic confidence. And Nixon, like Johnson, didn't really have that. But if there's an invasion, say, like a marine invasion of Cuba that is like bogged down there, then I think that's where the focus is. And maybe Vietnam is sort of kept on a back burner to an extent. While like the show of force country, the set piece country of the Cold War becomes Cuba 90 miles away rather than Vietnam.
Well, I think that, that last point you're making about 90 miles is kind of one of the key things there, because I don't think that the U.S. could actually sustain war in that kind of 90 miles from Miami, et cetera, unless it was seeking to win it totally. Because remember, the reason that the Americans are also trying to wage a war there is that they have all these goddamn Cubans breathing down their necks, whom they've recruited and mobilized, and who ideally are going to be the ones who run the country once they succeed militarily. So there is also like this force that like if they're going to do Cuba, that they like go through with it in that way. I think that Vietnam is sort of like helpful as kind of also looking at like where when you look at the state of the American military more generally, like and this is also where a lot of the companies that Nixon's initial constituents worked for and so on, like McDonnell Douglas or something, they're the ones who make all these airplanes and air power and bombs and bomb components and radar mapping and sensors and so on, that are ultimately these technologies that are incredibly useful for the kind of war we wage in Vietnam, which is by and large like unfathomable amounts of ordnance. Dropping napalm and bombs. And that is the kind of thing like that we couldn't have really done that to Cuba for a number of different reasons, but that we were able to do it in Vietnam, that we were able to do it in Cambodia, like to me sort of shows that like, that was actually like there would have been a really strong incentive to have like, picked up where the French had left off in Vietnam, even though Cuba may have had more opportunity for success than it would have under Kennedy, so to speak.
No, that's a very good point, because during the Vietnam War, a lot of people would argue against it by saying, why are we fighting people 3,000 miles away? And the answer is because that's precisely where we had to fight them. Like if we're going to do this high ordnance, high intensity conflict, it basically has to be halfway around the world, or else it risks escalating too much.
Exactly. And this is also, part of the legacy of like America's imperial project begins not, the first American imperial project is like the genocide and dispossession of the Native Americans. The second, like more meaningful one, I would argue that, could basically get lumped in with the, after Mexico, I suppose, would be, when we get to the Philippines, an effort led by future Supreme Commander of the Allied, or the father of future Supreme Commander of Asia Pacific, Douglas MacArthur. You have this brutal crazy military occupation that begins there. And so it's this American entanglement in Asia and the domination of the Pacific that, requires the demand for America to build the Great White Fleet. And then after the Great White Fleet to build the best Air Force, an Air Force, by the way, whose effort, like the mythology of that Air Force is and how it was built is really staggering. It was highly controversial that America stacked all its ships in that way, not just for tactical reasons ultimately, but because the people and the personalities that were pushing it were ultimately doing so, pushing against the grain of the entire military. I mean, there was a fanatic zeal to the growth of the American bomb power.
Yeah, and I think a particularly ideological one. If anybody actually is interested, I just published a piece called The Progressive Origins of Project Rand that gets into this. And this is, I think, leads us to our next point, because one of the things that's unique about the Kennedy administration is that he really creates the national security state as we know it today. It's only with Kennedy that all the guys from the Rand Corporation are actually invited into the government. And one of the reasons that we actually did do that type of aerial escalation in Vietnam is because you have eggheads, people like Walt Rostow, for example, arguing in favor of this graduated deterrence that could be rationally pursued. Dick Nixon in no world invites any of those people into the administration. There are no eggheads in the Dick Nixon administration. So that is also really interesting to me. He's not inviting people like Charles Hitch or Elaine Enthoven or my friend Hans Speyer into the administration.
You know why? It's not just that he distrusts them and he thinks they're commies and Jews or whatever. It's because he's smarter than all of them. Here's the thing that we got to remember. Nixon is vastly more intelligent than John F. Kennedy is. He's vastly more knowledgeable about the way the world works. He is a smarter guy, which means that he doesn't really need these motherfuckers buzzing in his ear. Like he doesn't feel that insecurity that he has to shore up. And he is the smartest guy in the room most of the time.
He has then also an advantage of knowing, and this is a really good point in terms of, what makes him so intelligent by that point, is that like he's seen quite a bit. And so he has seen the limits of air power as somebody who is one of its enthusiastic boosters, right? Like this is one of the, like a paradox that sometimes comes into play, where often people who have been, like such a, somebody like Nixon, who is, who is no stranger to annihilationist rhetoric when it comes to the communists, he's also able to, let's say when he is, to bring up the example you used earlier, Danny, of like say, when Curtis LeMay is on the phone saying, like, Mr. President, we've got to drop 30 bombs in, Grenada or whatever he's decided that day. Nixon actually does have, he's like, I've seen this movie before. I know what happens when we scorch the earth and we don't, it doesn't, we like he can because he's intelligent there. What it means is that he's able to, like, when, at least as I see him, Nixon is able to come up with way more legitimate rationalizations to do the more sensible thing that he would be otherwise expected to do because of that vast experience. So when presented with the situation to, again, start nuclear conflict, like, something that not even Trump being advised by John Bolton managed to pull off, like, obviously many decades of anti-nuclear dogma later, but still, Nixon, I think, is ultimately constrained by, the kinds of forces that people would, I think, used to, would chalk up to, like, history or the position of the great man or whatever, but are ultimately just like the way myriad complex factors that just, amount to deterrence, or that, are forcing history to conform to, the trajectory that we ended up seeing it take, let's say, like in Vietnam, where you have, 2 decades of mass employment in aircraft engineering and manufacturing. And, those bombs are collecting a lot of dust, man. And that's, becomes a factor that ultimately, Nixon would have to confront, just like Kennedy, and vice versa. At least as it regards to Vietnam.
So then what do you think the national security state looks under Nixon in the 1960s? Because from my read of the history, it is a thing that really does get going with Truman, the National Security Act. We all know that. And it does exist in the 1950s, and it is influential in certain degrees. But it really only becomes the behemoth, or really only starts becoming the behemoth that it does become in the 1960s with the entrance of all of these guys into the Kennedy administration. And then they get even more power under LBJ, particularly during Vietnam. What happens if there's no Robert McNamara in office? What happens if there's no systems analysis that comes to define the American war effort in Vietnam? What does the national security state look like under a Dick Nixon?
The first thing to say is, like, different people get military contracts, and that's a really important, one of the big scandal of the military at that high level during when Kennedy got popped was not actually like the missile crisis and his rift with them over that. It was actually about the fighter plane TFX, one of my favorite incidents to look at. And basically, I.F. Stone wrote a marvelous article for the New York Review of Books in the 1960s where he basically says, like, McNamara intervened on behalf of General Dynamics' bid. And General Dynamics was the big industrial patron of Lyndon Johnson, among many other things. And one of the things that, I think that episode especially illustrates the sort of rank favoritism when General Dynamics gets the bid over Boeing, illustrates the, sort of kind of all the different, like, rivalries that don't conform to politics or ideological politics, but are really just the kind of, like, quite frankly, Third Reich gangster war industrialism that is, sort of, I guess, fairly endemic to how these industries tend to operate. So I think in the case of the CIA, the instinct would have been, what could they have done more operationally in the ways of Guatemala and Cuba? Where could they have, tried to operate with a heavier hand? I'm not sure. I think Asia would have ultimately, Nixon was always so fascinated by China and was always so fascinated by East Asia that, even if it hadn't been Vietnam, it wouldn't have surprised me if he had begun to say, like, the way that we're going to, be a pincer, God damn it, we're going to get him in Berlin and we're going to get him in Asia, and, like, you can see him, coming up with some kind of strategy like that actually would have basically just been recreating the Atchison, what's that fucking thing? A crescent?
Yeah. like
Great
the
Crescent
alliance against.
Yeah. So, like it would have just been like Nixon would have just founded another great. I mean, he basically just would have rebuilt containment. I think, it would have been like like basically would have gotten to containment rollback. That's actually how I kind of see it. I think that he would have restored the CIA with a vaster bureaucracy. It would have grown along a similar trajectory or whatever as you were describing, Danny. It would have come into its own, but with a far broader operation, a far more intense operational mandate.
A very different character. I mean, you wouldn't have Kissinger. Kissinger is made possible by the move from the think tanks to the Kennedy and LBJ administrations. I think you have a very different U.S. foreign policy looks very different because I do think that there's agency there. And if you have, I mean, who would staff Nixon's NSC? Where would he be getting? I guess they would probably be Eisenhower administration people. So the classic lawyers, businessmen, etc.
I mean, he probably he probably would have. Robert McNamara could have very easily been the Secretary of Defense in his administration.
I mean, he picked Henry Cabot Lodge as his VP to the bafflement of a lot of Republicans who felt that he did not bring anything to the ticket, but it represented Nixon's compulsive need to keep the sleeping dogs of Wall Street and Harvard lie by throwing him a bone in the form of putting this fucking blue blood Ivy League motherfucker on the ticket.
Yankee like Nixon was always very conscious of like the Yankee power base. He really never, I think it's again like one of these, it's part of why I think like the Watergate mania, in terms of like obsessing over the what I would just describe as like the imitation salaciousness that people treat it with at the moment. Like to me, a lot of these like Nixon's tensions with the Eastern establishment, with other his power block versus other power block, industrial competition, financial competition, which becomes much more serious in the 1970s, and if anything, actually comes after like Nixon and a lot of his cronies, kind of the SNLs who had backed him, for example, become some of the huge backers of Reagan in the late 70s and into the early 1980s. So, to me, there is a very, I guess, I mean, and then there are these figures, by the way, who kind of represent a convergence, right? Like John Connolly, who is, I think, like a really great example of how you can see a lot of the forces that were sort of, advancing with history then, the ascendance of the Texas oil companies and so on. I mean, that's a force that finds its way into the White House no matter who's in charge, it would seem.
Well, what just occurred to me is that maybe Nixon brings in people from a little organization found in Appleton, Wisconsin in December 1958, the John Birch Society. So what's one of the major things that happens in the 1970s, of course, is you get the creation of the modern Republican Party and its famous three legs. What happens to the Birchers and the evangelicals if Nixon is in power a decade earlier than he is? That to me is a very interesting question.
So this is actually, wait, hold up one second. I had this awesome book called The Yahoos that's about the Birch Society from that time. So, like, the Birchers are, like, it's important to understand also that, like, the Birchers are, if anything, like the Nixon mob in, like, the Birch Society. Like, those people, they have a lot of history because they're basically, all part of the people who were allied with Chiang Kai-shek back when his cause in trying to reshape China was, like, the dominant, right-wing foreign policy cause celebre. Like, if you go to the like as a shorthand, way of illustrating it, if you go to the website of the Truman Library, they have a whole section of records that's just about the China lobby, and it sticks out. And Nixon and the John Birch Society, a lot of the people who co-founded, funded the John Birch Society were China lobby figures. They were really, really involved, had many business interests wrapped up with Chiang Kai-shek, were involved in, running a lot of West Coast businesses that had import-exporting businesses, shipping businesses wrapped up in China, had a lot at stake there. So I think that those people would have probably been, to the extent that they still would have had political utility in enforcing, whatever the hegemony you need right-wing paramilitary thugs for, then they would have been given a free hand. But the problem, again, the countervailing force there is, well, you would be empowering them at the same time that some freedom rides are going down in Selma, Alabama. And again, you are then, it's like, all right, would Richard Nixon empower the members of his coalition who would be, like, ramping up lynchings in the South. And that is a fucking, like, I am not sure Richard Nixon ends up going along with that. I think that, like, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI happily cracked down on that stuff when it finally became, like, absolutely politically convenient and necessary for them to do so. I imagine they would do the same thing for Nixon.
In the early 60s, he needs them a lot less than he would in the 1970s with the reaction to the new left. But what do you guys think about evangelicals? Or Matt, do you have any thoughts on that fellow Wisconsin society?
I mean, the question is what I think a lot of it boils down to: how does Nixon respond to civil rights? Because this is, as we said, the dominant domestic issue. And reactionaries and evangelicals they find their footing in the battle over civil rights and integration of the South. And if Nixon does not decide to do a brilliant end run and return the African American voter to his Republican bosom, and we say no, he doubles down on the right wing drift sort of the Republican Party that's already incipient. It grabs the Taft tail, the people who were coalescing around Goldwater at the time, and doubles down on them. Then you see a refusal at the federal level to do anything about civil rights, which I think leads to an acceleration of the violent phase of the civil rights movement. In our world, the Watts riot is sort of a precursor to the whole explosion of contradictions that happens in the late 60s. In 1965, you could easily see a situation where that timeline accelerates and you see 68 style riots in the early 60s in what would have been Kennedy's first term.
Let's not forget, like, there was already, like, a fair amount of, like, social violence on that scale that, like, people are, like, is just sort of conventionally not really recalled, like, whether it's in Newark or in also rural America as well. I mean, you have, like, as Danny was alluding to with the evangelicals, you have the beginnings of, like, rural white middle class Christian backlash. Like, Pearlstein has a bunch of good anecdotes about this in Nixon land, communities that are not particularly religious being, extremely motivated and energized all of a sudden by, like, a curriculum that supposedly takes, removes the Bible or something. And I think that kind of, like, it's I mean, it's very interesting because, I wouldn't, like, when you just, like, knowing how things did turn out and how ultimately those contradictions were or weren't resolved, I think that it would be really, really difficult because, like, to imagine how some of these contradictions would work out in a different way than they have, simply because one of the really big forces that has, ended up, forcing the outcomes of the civil right in the 1960s, at least in social, civil rights legislation in the way that it did then, was the increasing political polarization, that begins at that time, that sort of, outward push that doesn't really yield, has not yielded to the present, that bifurcation, because that is sort of also what drives this. And, could the Republican Party be both things? Could it manage that response? Ultimately, I think that, like, if there was that kind of mass violence breaking out before the election of 64, a Democrat would come into the office and pass major social policy and also rapidly increase funding for the police in the model that ultimately came to pass in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I'd say that, like, a Nixon who goes hard right in response to the civil rights movement sees, he runs for re-election with, like, George Wallace as his running mate. And I think would probably have gotten creamed by like Eugene McCarthy or somebody.
So, guys, let's end on this now, because the 60s, as you know, is more than a decade. The 60s is a vibe. And it's a vibe that basically gets going with JFK in a lot of ways, whether you're thinking about the Alliance for Progress and this sort of decade of development, whether you're thinking about the Peace Corps, which turns into the Teacher Corps, whether you're thinking about, the assassination of JFK really pulled the wool out from people and got the 60s going. He killed the male hat. We'd still be wearing fedoras. Like a teenage Matt Christman, we would be wearing fedoras today. But how do you think, I think this is kind of an interesting question, because do you even get the new left if there's a Nixon in there? What happens if the baby boomers' first conscious political moment is not cool JFK and Camelot and him getting assassinated in 63? What if it's Dick Nixon? How does that change the vibe of the 60s? How does that change the baby boomers' trajectory?
I think that one of the big things, like the sort of, a big shift is basically like Nixon was so contemptible, like, in a very particularly and culturally stratified way. There's this apocryphal, I say apocryphal because it's not real, like the context is not really fair, but like there's this apocryphal story about Pauline Kael being in a theater and being like, I don't, and writing like, I didn't know anybody in here who could have voted for Nixon when he, won re-election in 72 by the landslide that he did. And I think that that kind of part of me, the immediate question I put to myself is then, would that kind of, red state, blue state kind of degree of like, disaffiliation from, so much of the polis that comes, with Nixon, is at least, even if it's just in vibe, that is really the, and is itself more than anything kind of a reflection of the culmination of the 60s rather than any, whole impulse by itself. I don't know. I think that like, Nixon may ultimately have been defeated by a John Kennedy who is 4 years older. And if anything, his health issues had gotten a bit better and he wasn't totally doped up all the time. And, maybe he found God and wasn't sleeping around or something. And then baby boomers are even more brain rotted because they got a cool president who lived.
Matt, any takes on the Nixon 60s? What's the vibe of the Nixon 60s?
Well, I think you see some sort of open race war in America, like at a lower. I mean, obviously we had that for 20 years. I mean, we had it basically since the end of the Civil War. It just gained. It went up and down in time, in intensity. You'd have spikes, like a big spike at the end of Reconstruction with the Redeemers,
and we measure it. We measure it with our e-meters. Value.
A big spike in the post World War I era, the Red Summer, 1917 or 1919. And then, of course, a big spike after World War II. And I think it just would have been a more intense and earlier a creation, which makes me think, does that accelerate the creation of this like newly enlightened, middle class who end up being the social auxiliaries of the civil rights movement? Or do they sort of retreat into racial awareness? And does that sort of that process of cosmopolitanization that occurs when you wire up a country with a media network that connects them all to each other instantaneously, maybe that gets interrupted and broken up before it can really have an effect. I mean, it's I don't know, and or there's a question because America has always been this one way or another tenuously assembled structure that really depends on a lot more than other countries on people all sort of collectively agreeing to lie to each other because of our constitutional system, which means if there's greater stress placed on it earlier, do we see instead of, this culture war, a return to sectional civil war?
Well, I think that one of the big, like, and this is sort of like, it's a great example of like, like the weird push and pull of history, right? Because what you were correctly describing as the moment of like this incredible schism, what is Eisenhower doing? He's laying down the interstates. He is building the physical infrastructure to connect the nation as never before. By the way, opting for cars over rail and all that, but like still, moreover, there is a logic of national development that is, I think, like, part of, you could even argue is part of what ultimately, it's those decisions made in the 50s to commit America to confront the Cold War and communist threat as one nation, as one unified nation, that ultimately makes it so that by the 1960s, the federal government, whether, Richard Nixon would want it or not, is on a fucking collision course with the South. Is like on the race question, as it were, breaks out into the open again. And, does Richard Nixon accidentally help stoke a race war, or does he bottle it? And that is a true, like, that's a true flip a coin, sir, to me.
In order to bottle it, Nixon would have to carry out like a continuation of Eisenhower's domestic spending agenda, which was coming into direct conflict with its military spending, a reckoning that ended up coming in the 70s, and that would have been there the whole time. And the question is, does capital essentially allow Nixon to fulfill that? Or is the threat it poses, like the threat, like there was an option in the 1970s during the stagflation era to fix the problem by dumping money on the lowest quadrant of Americans, just hugely increasing their spending capacity to soak up this inflation. That could have been done, but that would have been literally empowering with a direct redistribution of fucking resources and capital, the most dispossessed and therefore most racially coded American.
Well, but this is why, like, you know, but this is Nixon. But brother, Nixon did introduce the solution to this in his presidency. What would become the tried and true method, also re-employed with the 1986 National Security Declaration of Ronald Reagan, which is that there is a war on drugs, and that there, in addition to being a war on drugs that has to rapidly increase the number of people that we, you know, prosecute, we also have to lock them up, which becomes, by the way, a marvelous regional employment program all across America. And so that, to me, is, you know, one of the things. Then, you know, we also then, you know, would Nixon have to turn to the carceral solution to the problems you lay out, of the fact that if you're going to have this redistribution effect, you know, like you can do it you can either actually reckon with it and, you know, like empower the proletariat that would kill you, or you can lock them up and, you know, actually find ways to take the directionally, you know, most disadvantaged by, you know, the, you know, laissez-faire system, people who live in, you know, rural, you know, Colorado, and poof, in the 1990s, ADX Florence pops up there, and then they have a jail. Or you do it in, you know, in 1960, what succeeds Alcatraz? It's, you know, Alcatraz moves from being a prison where the Supermax facility where they lock up people, you know, next to San Francisco, whatever. It's relocated when it's closed to Marion, Illinois, in the middle of nowhere. So there's a way in which you can literally see what Matt's talking about in terms of how they actually would resolve those directional conflicts, and did, both under Democratic administrations in the 1960s and then again in the 1970s after they had launched, you know, the drug wars.
And you have with Carter a guy who just was not what he was driven by his conscience to do was exactly what Nixon had been specifically trying to avoid, which is neutering the American political structure, like neutering the power of the president and America as like a self-determining political entity. And that is, that's the reason some people think that he got basically stitched up on Watergate to get him out of there, because
Lobo Homo said, yeah, goodbye, Dickie. Bye-bye.
People are talking about it, folks. People are saying it more and more. But if we say, so Nixon gets a chance early to assert himself and create this new like carceral welfare state, does that do anything to prevent the neoliberal turn when the inevitable 70s energy crisis kicks in?
Well, I think, though, that what we're describing is the neoliberal term come early. The difference is that, like, the intellectual maturation that had happened by the end of the 70s that allowed, like, what we call neoliberal as, like, an intellectual movement to sort of, like, you know, develop. I think that, like, that scaffolding hadn't been, like, Hayek's reputation hadn't been adequately resuscitated yet. Milton Friedman hadn't had his big heyday. He hadn't won his Nobel yet. I think,
and there's no deindustrialization yet, or at least not to the same degree.
So precisely.
And this actually leads me to an interesting hinge point. Maybe we should gather the three of us next season, which is Nixon is president in the early 60s. Then JFK does 2 terms, and then Nixon comes back. And what does that look like?
Yes.
Nixon in the early 70s. Noah Kulwin of the Blowback podcast, thank you so much for joining Matt and myself. We really appreciate it and look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to coming back.
You don't have Kulwin to kick around anymore.
You won't have Kulwin to kick around anymore.
All right, guys. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Later.